The first thing wasn't sight. It was the silence. Heavy, sterilized. The kind of absolute quiet that presses against your eardrums like deep water. I gasped, air rushing into lungs that felt too tight, and immediately my hand flew to my neck. There was a point of heat there, a throbbing anchor just below the jawline that seemed to dictate the rhythm of my pulse. I didn't know how I got here. I didn't know why the sheets felt like silk or why the air smelled of ozone. I just knew danger was close. Then I saw her, standing in the periphery, perfectly still, radiating a calm that felt terrifyingly familiar. She moved toward the bed, and the motion was liquid. No wasted energy, just a predatory fluidity that made the hair on my arms stand up. The room around us was a testament to extreme, lonely wealth. Floor-to-ceiling glass revealing a city skyline that looked like a circuit board of cold light. Furniture that was more sculpture than comfort. Everything sharp angles and shadows. "You're awake," she said. Her voice was low, a cello note vibrating in my chest. "Who are you?" My voice was a wreck, scraping against a throat that felt raw. She paused, tilting her head with a bird-like curiosity. "I'm Freya, your wife." The word hung in the sterile air, absurd and heavy. My journalist instincts, usually a roaring fire of skepticism, flickered to life. I scanned her, the tailored suit that cost more than my first car, the posture of a CEO facing a hostile board, the lack of a wedding ring on my own finger. Everything screamed fabrication. My brain started cataloging the inconsistencies, the lack of personal photos, the clinical scent of the room, the way she stood just outside of striking distance. "We've been married for 6 months, she continued, the lie smooth like rehearsed copy. "There was an accident. You're confused. Dr. Eris said this would happen." I tried to sit up, but the room spun. Freya was there instantly. Her hands landed on my shoulders to steady me, and that's when the logic short-circuited. Her skin was shockingly cool, like marble kept in a cellar, but the contact sent a jolt of confusing dopamine straight to my brain. The fear evaporated, replaced by a chemical longing so intense it made my knees weak. It wasn't just relief. It was a biological imperative to be closer to her. Like a complex algorithm finally resolving, my body recognized her even if my mind didn't. "Easy," she murmured, her thumb tracing the line of my collarbone. "Your vitals are still stabilizing." "I don't remember you," I whispered, but my body was betraying me, leaning into her touch. "The mind protects itself," she said, her gaze holding mine, unflinching. Her eyes were dark, endless, flickering with something possessive. Not love exactly, ownership. She stepped back, breaking the contact, and the cold returned, rushing into the space she left behind. "I'll get Dr. Eris," she said, turning away. "Stay here." As the door clicked shut, the silence rushed back in. I swung my legs over the edge of the bed, ignoring her order. I needed to see. I needed to know who I was. I stumbled toward the expansive window, the city lights blurring into streaks of neon. But it wasn't the view that stopped me. It was the reflection in the dark glass. The face staring back was mine, but the eyes were wrong. The pupils were blown wide, swallowing the iris, dilated in a way that should have been blinding in the light. They looked predatory, hungry. And on my neck, stark against the pale skin, were 2 small, angry puncture marks. I wasn't just a patient in a high-rise clinic. I was something else entirely. And the woman who claimed to be my wife wasn't nursing me back to health. She was keeping a newly made thing contained. The fear was real, but the pull was stronger. Dr. Eris didn't look like a trauma specialist. He looked like he curated private art collections for warlords, impeccably dressed in a charcoal suit, movements precise, eyes that had seen too much and judged it all acceptable. He sat opposite me in a low leather chair, maintaining a professional distance that felt less like therapy and more like an interrogation. "Trauma recovery is a non-linear process," he began. His voice was soft, modulating perfectly to de-escalate a panic that was currently clawing at my throat. "What you're experiencing, the disorientation, the photophobia, the gaps in your memory, is consistent with the neurological aftermath of the crash. We call it hyperacute sensory integration." "The crash," I repeated. The word felt foreign, like a stone in my mouth. "I don't remember a car." "Retrograde amnesia is common," Eris noted, scribbling on a tab. The sound of his stylus hitting the glass screen wasn't a tap. It was a gunshot. I flinched, my hands flying to my ears. The hum of the recessed lighting overhead, previously a background buzz, suddenly amplified into a hive of angry wasps. The air conditioning vent in the corner roared like a jet engine, the friction of the air against the metal grate scraping against my nerves. My senses weren't just recovering, they were rioting. The room began to tilt, the sensory input crashing over me in a nauseating, violent wave. Then, a hand landed on my shoulder. Cool, firm, absolute. Freya. The moment she made contact, the noise didn't stop, but it receded behind a heavy velvet curtain. It was as if she were a grounding rod, channeling the excess voltage out of my system before it could fry my circuits. The relief was instantaneous and terrifying. I leaned into her touch without meaning to, my body recognizing her as the only safe harbor in a storm of sensory violence. It was a chemical dependency formed in seconds. Without her, the world was too loud, too bright, too sharp. With her, it was manageable. "She needs to stabilize," Freya said. Her voice didn't boom, but it carried a weight that made the doctor pause his scribbling. "The sensory gating issues will pass," Eris said, watching the interaction, watching me cling to her, with clinical interest. "Her brain is rewiring itself to process higher fidelity inputs. But we need to monitor the hormone levels." He reached into his bag and pulled out a tourniquet and a needle. The sight of the steel didn't scare me. It was the smell. As he prepped my arm, a drop of blood welled up from a tiny scratch on his own thumb, likely from a paper cut or a zipper. It hit me like a physical blow. The scent of iron, salt, and something rich and vital filled the room, drowning out the antiseptic. My mouth watered. A sharp, cramping hunger twisted my gut, completely unrelated to the need for food. It was a hollow, clawing ache that demanded to be filled. Freya stepped between me and the doctor, obscuring my view of him, her body blocking the scent like a shield. "Make it quick, Eris." He drew the blood efficiently. I watched the vial fill, dark and heavy. It didn't look like the blood I used to see when I scraped a knee. It looked potent. "The accident," I managed to say, forcing my mind away from the hunger and back to the facts. "Where did it happen?" "The tunnel on the east side," Eris said, capping the vial. "You were driving. A truck lost control. Freya pulled you out before the fire." I looked at my hands. No burns, no scars, just the puncture marks on my neck, and a body that felt like it had been remade in a factory that built weapons. My journalist instincts were screaming. If I had been pulled from a fire, where was the smoke damage? Where was the trauma to the skin? The narrative was too clean, a press release, rather than a reality. "Right," I said, the lie tasting like ash. Eris packed his bag, standing up. "Rest. Feed. The transition, the recovery, depends on it." He left without looking back. The door clicked shut, and the silence that followed wasn't empty. It was charged, vibrating with the sudden absence of the threat, leaving me alone with the predator who claimed to be my savior. Dinner arrived on a sleek, silent cart, a masterpiece of culinary art my eyes appreciated, but my stomach reviled. The steak was a perfect medium rare, the reduction glistened, and the truffled potatoes smelled of earth. But when the scent hit my nose, my stomach turned. It smelled like decay, like something dead far too long. Freya sat at the head of the table, watching me with that unreadable, magnetic calm. "Dr. Eris suggests you try," she said, her voice soft yet filled with expectation. I picked up the heavy silver fork. I was a journalist. I dealt in facts. The fact was, I needed fuel. I cut a small piece and forced it into my mouth. Immediate rejection. The texture was wrong. Grit and ash, dry paper disintegrating on my tongue. The taste was a void. I gagged, spitting the bite into the linen napkin, gasping for air. "I can't," I choked out, pushing the plate away. "It tastes like dust." "It's not the food," Freya said, standing. The movement was a blur of silk. "It's the vessel." The real hunger woke up then. It wasn't a rumble. It was a shriek in the blood, a hollow, clawing ache centered behind my sternum, scraping me out from the inside. It was a biological panic, a red light flashing on a dashboard indicating catastrophic system failure. My vision swam. I gripped the marble table until my knuckles turned white. Freya moved to a climate-controlled cabinet. She pulled out a decanter filled with something opaque and viscous, pouring it into a crystal tumbler. She placed it in front of me. The liquid was dark, nearly black, but with ruby highlights. The smell hit me like a physical caress. Iron, salt, ozone. It smelled like a heartbeat. "Drink," she murmured. I stared at the glass. My history was a map of fighting for autonomy. I had spent years clawing my way out of relationships where love was a synonym for control, where dependency was the currency. To be this vulnerable was to be erased. My mind screamed to throw the glass against the wall, to reject this monstrous evolution, but my hand moved on its own. The tremor in my fingers stopped the moment I touched the crystal. Freya watched, her pupils expanding. She wasn't just observing, she was participating. I lifted the glass. The first sip wasn't a drink. It was a suture. The liquid was thick, cool, and metallic. As it slid down, the sensation was explosive. The hollow ache in my chest didn't just fill, it was stitched shut with threads of fire. The gray at the edges of my vision snapped back into hyper-definition. The weakness evaporated, replaced by a hydraulic strength humming under my skin. It was terrifyingly effective. The panic vanished, replaced by a heavy, narcotic warmth. I drained the glass. I couldn't stop. When I set it down, the silence of the penthouse was no longer oppressive. It was peaceful. I felt anchored, sated. Freya was closer now, standing beside my chair. She reached out, her thumb brushing the corner of my mouth, catching a stray drop. She brought it to her own lips, her eyes locking onto mine with an intensity that pinned me to the chair. "Better?" she asked. "Yes," I whispered, the word heavy with a gratitude that tasted like defeat. I hated how good I felt. I hated that she was the source. I looked up, expecting triumph. Instead, I saw relief. She rested her hand on the back of my neck, fingers cool against my heated skin. "Good," she said, the vibration of her voice traveling into my spine. "We have an event tonight. You'll need the strength." I leaned back into her touch, the monster in my blood purring in satisfaction, while the woman in my mind screamed in a room that was suddenly soundproof. The dress Freya laid out for me was midnight blue velvet, high-necked and long-sleeved, tailored with a precision that bordered on architectural. It wasn't just fashion, It was containment. As I pulled it on, the heavy fabric felt like armor, designed to keep the world out. Or perhaps to keep the new version of me in. I stood before the full-length mirror, fastening the collar that perfectly obscured the twin puncture marks on my neck. My reflection was jarring. The soft curves I remembered from years of desk lunches and late-night stakeouts were gone, replaced by a lean, predatory geometry. My muscles looked wired, coiled tight under skin that seemed too pale, too flawless. I didn't look like a survivor of a car crash. I looked dangerous. I looked like her. "Ready?" Freya asked from the doorway. She was wearing a tuxedo cut sharp enough to draw blood, her hair slicked back to expose the severe, beautiful line of her jaw. She looked like a weapon sheathed in silk. "As I'll ever be," I replied. The lie came easier this time, smoothing over the jagged edges of my panic. The drive to the auction house was a blur of motion I couldn't quite track. The city lights smeared into long neon ribbons against the tinted windows of the limousine. Inside, the air was pressurized with silence. Freya didn't speak, but her presence was a physical weight, a gravity well pulling at my center of gravity. She sat close enough that our knees brushed with every turn, sending spikes of that confusing, electric heat through my veins. It was maddening. My mind knew she was my captor, but my body hummed in her proximity, like a tuning fork struck against glass. When the doors opened, the noise of the crowd hit me like a physical blow. It wasn't just sound, it was a chaotic data stream. I could hear the friction of silk against skin, the clinking of crystal 3 rooms away, the rapid, nervous heartbeats of the valet drivers. It was overwhelming, a cacophony that threatened to buckle my knees. I stumbled, gasping as the sensory input spiked into pain. Freya's hand found the small of my back instantly. The contact was cool and firm, a circuit breaker snapping into place. "Focus on me," she whispered, her voice cutting through the din like a laser. "Filter it out. Anchor yourself." I focused on the cold pressure of her palm. The chaos receded, dampening into a manageable hum. We moved into the auction hall, a shark entering a reef. The crowd parted. These were the city's elite, tech moguls, old money, politicians, people who usually demanded attention. But here, they shrank. Eyes lowered. Conversations died and were reborn in hushed whispers as we passed. Faces swam into view. Faces I recognized from bylines and gala photos in my previous life. A senator nodded with terrified respect. A tech CEO raised a glass with a trembling hand. They congratulated us on the marriage, their smiles tight and practiced. I recognized them, knew their names, knew I had files on half of them on a hard drive somewhere, but the context was slippery, like trying to hold water in a sieve. "Freya," a man approached, blocking our path. He was older, smelling of expensive scotch and fear. "I didn't think we'd see you, or your new wife, out so soon." I knew him, Marcus Sterling, media mogul. A rival. "We're celebrating, Marcus," Freya said, her smile not reaching her eyes. "Why hide happiness?" Sterling looked at me, his gaze lingering on the high collar of my dress. "Indeed, it's quite the merger. I suppose this means we're finally burying the hatchet?" Burying the hatchet. The phrase didn't just land, it detonated. A sharp, violent headache spiked behind my eyes. The room tilted. That wasn't just a figure of speech. It was a memory key. Burying the hatchet. The words weren't a metaphor. They were a key turning in a rusted lock. The ballroom dissolved. The scent of expensive perfume and champagne evaporated, replaced by the smell of stale coffee and ozone. I was back in a boardroom, not a penthouse. The table wasn't set for dinner. It was strewn with dossiers, I wasn't wearing velvet. I was in a thrifted blazer, shaking with adrenaline and caffeine. I was standing at the end of a long glass table, pointing a finger at her. Freya. She sat there, unbothered, checking a watch that cost more than my annual salary. I have the sources, Freya, I was shouting. I know about the shell companies. I know about the disappearances. I'm going to burn your empire to the ground. She looked up then, that same maddening, calm smile playing on her lips. Be careful with fire, darling. You might not like what rises from the ashes. The memory snapped shut. The auction hall rushed back in, the noise, the light, the suffocating pretense. I stared at Marcus Sterling, then at the woman standing beside me. The woman whose hand was on my back. The woman who claimed to be my wife. We weren't married. We were enemies. I wasn't her partner. I was her target. Or she was mine. The realization was a physical nausea. The love I felt, the chemical pull, it was artificial. A biological trick. My mind reeled, the cognitive dissonance crashing against the manufactured bond. I looked at Freya. She wasn't looking at Marcus. She was looking at me, her eyes narrowing slightly. She knew, I remembered. Excuse us, I said. My voice was unrecognizable, low, dangerous, devoid of the trembling confusion that had defined my existence since waking up. I didn't wait for a response. I turned and walked toward the semi-private viewing corridor, moving with a speed that forced the crowd to part or be trampled. I didn't look back. I could feel her following, a shadow detached from the light. I shoved open the door to a viewing room housing a solitary, grotesque, modernist sculpture. The moment the door clicked shut, the silence returned, heavy and thick. I spun around. You lied! Freya stood by the door, impassive. I curated the truth. We aren't married. I stepped forward, the rage finally burning through the hunger. I was investigating you. I was writing an exposé on your firm. That's why I was in the car. That's why I was near the tunnel. You were obsessed, Freya corrected, her voice smooth. You tracked my movements for months. You hacked my private servers. You knew my schedule better than my chief of staff. Call it investigation if you want, but from where I sat, it looked like courtship. I wanted to destroy you, I hissed. And yet, here we are. The arrogance of it, the sheer, unrepentant manipulation, snapped the last tether of my control. I didn't decide to move. It just happened. My body, this new, terrifying instrument, reacted to the anger with lethal efficiency. I lunged. It wasn't a human movement. It was a blur. 1 second I was 10 feet away. The next, my hand was wrapped around her throat, slamming her back against the gallery wall. Crack! The sound was sickeningly loud. The plaster behind her shoulder gave way, spiderwebbing outward from the impact. Dust drifted down onto the pristine shoulder of her tuxedo. I froze, staring at my own hand. I hadn't meant to use that much force. I had just wanted to grab her, to shake the truth out of her. But I had pinned her with the strength of a hydraulic press. I could feel the pulse in her neck, slow, steady, unbothered, beating against my palm. Freya didn't fight. She didn't gasp. She didn't even blink. She looked down at my hand, then up at my eyes. And she smiled. Not the polite, public smile. A feral, private thing. There she is, she whispered, the sound vibrating against my skin. I could kill you, I said, my voice shaking. Not with exertion, but with the terrifying realization that it might be true. You could try, Freya purred. She leaned into my grip, her cool skin pressing against my palm. But you won't, because for the first time in your life, you aren't the victim in the room. You aren't the one who has to be afraid. She reached up, her fingers circling my wrist. She didn't try to pry me off. She held me there, anchoring the violence, validating it, Her eyes were blown wide, black pools of pride. She wasn't looking at a monster. She was looking at a masterpiece. We were rivals, yes, she admitted, her voice dropping to an intimate register. The best kind. The kind that ends in blood, or a vow. We just accelerated the timeline. I slowly released her, stepping back. The wall behind her held the imprint of her shoulders, a permanent scar in the plaster. Tell me everything, I demanded. The accident, the bite, the truth. Freya straightened her jacket, dusting the plaster from her shoulder with a casual flick. Not here. Home. I'll show you the files you were so desperate to die for. She opened the door, gesturing for me to lead, her gaze lingering on my hands with a hunger that matched my own. The penthouse felt different now. The silence wasn't sterile. It was the heavy, pressurized pause before a verdict. Freya didn't sit. She walked to the wall safe hidden behind a minimalist canvas, the biometric scanner flashing green under her palm, and pulled out a physical file. She slid it across the obsidian desk. Read it. I opened the folder. It wasn't a marriage license. It was a forensic report. Photos of my car, twisted metal wrapped around a concrete pillar like aluminum foil. A grainy surveillance shot of a man I didn't recognize kneeling by my wheel well hours before the crash. It wasn't an accident, Freya said, her voice stripped of the seduction, leaving only the cold steel of a CEO delivering a quarterly loss. It was a hit. The syndicate you were investigating, the one I told you to leave alone, didn't appreciate your persistence. They cut your brake lines. I stared at the timestamp. I remembered the tunnel. Not the impact, but the moment the brake pedal hit the floor and found nothing but air. The sickening, weightless suspension of gravity before the world ended. You were dying, she continued, pouring a drink but not offering one. Crushed spine, internal hemorrhage. The paramedics were 10 minutes out. You had 2. So you decided to play God, I said, my finger tracing the photo of the wreckage. I decided to intervene. She took a sip, the liquid dark and viscous against the crystal. I didn't turn you to possess you. I turned you because the alternative was watching a brilliant mind bleed out on wet asphalt. I made a calculation. I chose to preserve the asset. And the bride nonsense? I looked up, meeting her gaze. The fake marriage, the lies, legal cover for the hospital, she dismissed. But the title, bride, that isn't just a word. It's a biological bind. She stepped closer. I felt it immediately. A hum at the base of my skull, like a high-tension wire singing in the wind. It wasn't a sound. It was a sensation of location. I knew exactly where she was, not by sight, but by the magnetic pull in my blood. It was a GPS signal stitched into my nervous system. New fledglings are volatile, she explained, stopping inches from me. Your senses are rioting. Your hunger is a wildfire. Without a sire to anchor you, you would burn yourself out in a week. The bond acts as a regulator. I am your dialysis machine until your own system learns to filter the noise. I felt a wave of nausea that had nothing to do with the hunger. It was the violation. My body, my autonomy, the things I had fought so hard to reclaim from every controlling ex and overbearing editor, were no longer mine. I was tethered to her. A satellite locked in orbit around a planet I had tried to destroy. You took my choice, I whispered. The anger was a cold knot in my stomach. I gave you a different one, Freya countered, her gaze unflinching. Death is the absence of choice. This is just a new set of rules. She leaned down, her hands bracing on the arms of my chair, trapping me in her scent of cedar and ozone. You can hate me for it. Hate is a potent fuel. But don't pretend I didn't give you the weapon you need to survive what comes next. I looked back at the file. The assassin. the man who tried to erase me. Then I looked at my hands, pale, strong, capable of crushing plaster. The hum in my mind settled into a steady, rhythmic thrum. It was a leash, yes, but it was also a power line. "Who is he?" I asked, tapping the photo. "A freelancer," Freya said. "Disposable." "Good," I said, the word tasting like iron. "Because I'm going to find him." The anger didn't vanish, but it calcified into something useful. I didn't have to trust her. I just had to understand the mechanics of the cage until I was strong enough to break the bars. The education of a predator is a study in restraint, not violence. My body felt less like a vessel and more like a loaded weapon with a hair trigger, every movement over-torqued by the new hydraulic pressure in my veins. "Hold this," Freya commanded. She placed a baccarat champagne flute in my hand. "Don't crush it." It sounded simple. It was excruciating. My fingers wanted to close, to test the limits of the fragile stem. The crystal groaned, a high-pitched frequency only I could hear, threatening to turn to dust in my grip. "Too hard," she murmured, moving behind me. She didn't take the glass away. Instead, she covered my hands with hers. Her touch was cool, dry, and terrifyingly steady. She wasn't just correcting my grip, she was calibrating me. Her chest pressed against my back, a solid wall of support that sent a jolt of confusing heat through the cool sterility of my new physiology. "Shoulders down," she instructed, her breath ghosting against the sensitive skin of my ear. "You're projecting tension. A predator who looks tense looks weak. Relax into the strength." She guided my fingers, loosening the vice grip 1 millimeter at a time until the glass stopped singing. It was an intimacy that bypassed romance and went straight to survival. She was tuning an instrument she intended to play. I turned my head slightly, meeting her gaze. It was unflinching, a golden, assessing stare that stripped me down to the marrow. There was no pity in it, only expectation. "Now, move to the window," she said, stepping back. "Do not blur." I tried to walk normally, but my perception of time had shifted. I took a step and the room smeared. In a blink, I was slammed against the reinforced glass of the balcony door, the impact cracking the silence like a whip. I had crossed 30 feet in a heartbeat. "You're moving in frames per second," Freya critiqued, walking toward me with that maddening, liquid grace. "Smooth it out. You aren't glitching. You're flowing." She spent the next hour drilling me on the basics of motion. How to pour tea without snapping the handle. How to walk without cracking the marble tiles. How to filter the sensory assault of the city. "Close your eyes," she ordered. "Isolate the heartbeat in 4B. I focused. The cacophony of the building, the plumbing, the electrical hum, the wind faded. And there it was. A frantic, rabbit-kick rhythm 3 floors down. The maid, I realized. She's terrified. "She broke a vase," Freya noted. "She thinks she'll be fired. You hear that? That is information. That is leverage." She walked around me, her heels clicking a rhythm that my pulse tried to match. "Think of this union as a merger," she said, the corporate metaphor chillingly apt. "We are consolidating assets, my capital, my influence, and your new potential. You aren't just a wife. You are a controlling interest in a very old, very dangerous venture." I looked at my reflection in the glass. The fear was receding, replaced by a dark, seductive thrill. I had spent my life as a journalist, exposing power, always vulnerable to it. Now, I was the power. I could hear secrets through walls. I could move faster than a shutter speed. The vulnerability of my past life felt like a skin I was happy to shed. "I like it," I whispered, the admission tasting like copper. "Good," Freya said, picking up a heavy, cream-colored envelope from the console table. It was sealed with wax that smelled of resin and old blood. Because the board of directors has requested an audit of the new acquisition. The location was a brownstone in the financial district that didn't exist on any public map. From the street, it looked like a relic of the Gilded Age, dark and dormant. But as Freya placed her hand on the iron gate, the lock disengaged with a heavy, wet thud that sounded more like a heartbeat than a mechanism. Inside, the air was pressurized with silence. It smelled of cured tobacco, old leather, and the sharp copper tang of blood. Not fresh, but aged, like a vintage wine that had turned to vinegar. This wasn't a social club. It was a kill floor, dressed in mahogany and velvet. We moved through the hallway, my heels sinking into carpets so thick they felt like moss, until we reached the double doors at the end of the corridor. "Remember," Freya murmured, pausing with her hand on the brass handle, "you are not a supplicant. You are an investment." She pushed the doors open. The room was cavernous, lit only by the embers of a fireplace large enough to roast a steer. Around a long oval table sat 5 figures. To the human eye, they were the city's philanthropists and venture capitalists. I recognized the CEO of a pharmaceutical giant and a silent partner in a global defense firm. But to my new, sharpened senses, they were voids in the room. They didn't breathe. Their hearts beat with a slow, tectonic rhythm, once for every 10 of mine. They felt ancient. They felt like the ocean floor, heavy, dark, and crushing. "So," a woman at the head of the table said. Her voice was dry, like parchment crinkling. "This is the salvage operation." Freya didn't bow. She didn't apologize. She stood at my shoulder, not in front of me. "This is the acquisition." The woman, who I knew as wlwromance, leaned forward. Her eyes were milky, blind in the human spectrum, but I felt her gaze rake over my nervous system like a cold wire. "She reeks of trauma, Freya. You turned a journalist, a creature of exposure. You brought a spotlight into the shadows." "I brought a strategist," Freya corrected. "Someone who understands how to control the narrative, because she used to write it." "A liability," a man in a charcoal suit grunted. "She's a failed turning. Unstable." The pressure hit me then. It wasn't physical, it was atmospheric. The air in the room condensed, turning into a crushing weight centered directly on my chest. It was a test of will. They were pushing their collective psychic dominance onto me, trying to see if I would crack, if the fledgling mind would shatter under the weight of ancient authority. My knees buckled slightly. The instinct to submit, to bare my throat and beg for the pressure to stop, was overwhelming. It was the prey response, hardwired into my biology. I looked at Freya. She was watching me, her face impassive. She wasn't going to help. If I wanted a seat at this table, I had to take it. I closed my eyes and found that new, dark knot of hunger in my chest. I didn't suppress it. I pulled on it. I remembered the feeling of pinning Freya to the wall. I remembered the years of being talked over in newsrooms, of being told to kill stories that were too dangerous. I took that frustration, that ambition, and I braided it with the vampire aggression. I opened my eyes and pushed back. I didn't scream. I just projected a single, crystal clear thought. I am not the story. I am the editor. The pressure in the room snapped. The heavy atmosphere lifted, leaving a ringing silence in its wake. wlwromance smiled, revealing teeth that were slightly too sharp. "Arrogant," she mused, leaning back. "But stable." "She'll do," the defense contractor agreed, though his eyes remained cold. "As long as she remembers who signs the checks." "I sign my own," I said, my voice steady, surprising even myself. Freya's hand brushed mine. A silent accolade. "Then welcome to the board," Vance said, raising a glass of dark red vintage. Don't disappoint us. We don't do severance packages. We do liquidation. As we turned to leave, the adrenaline crash was almost euphoric. I had walked into the lion's den and walked out wearing a fur coat. But as we stepped back into the cool night air, the victory felt brittle. I had passed the test, but I had also seen the machinery behind the curtain. And I knew, with a journalist's certainty, that liquidation was not an idle threat. Freya was pulled into a sidebar conversation with Vance, leaving me drifting toward the mahogany bar. The adrenaline of the boardroom was fading, leaving behind a jagged edge of paranoia that the scotch in the air couldn't soothe. I ordered a soda water, just to have something to hold. Alcohol did nothing for me now, but dull the senses I needed sharp. I stared into the dark liquid, watching the bubbles rise, trying to catalog the new hierarchy I had just been inducted into. Impressive performance in there. The voice slid over my shoulder like oil. I didn't turn immediately. I checked the reflection in the mirror behind the bar. A man, late 20s, though likely much older given the company we were keeping. He had the kind of beauty that looked curated, too symmetrical, too polished, with hair the color of sand and eyes that held zero warmth. "I don't sign autographs," I said, turning slowly to face him. He laughed, a dry, rattling sound that grated against my heightened hearing. "Sharp. I see why she picked you." Freya always did like a challenge. "I'm Elias." He extended a hand. I didn't take it. The name clicked, not from my files, but from the gaps in them. The protégé. The one who ran the London office before it quietly dissolved and he was scrubbed from the company website. The ex-partner, I deduced, leaning back against the bar. Business or pleasure? Both. Neither. It's fluid with her. Elias leaned in, invading my personal space. He didn't smell like the others. Underneath the expensive cologne and the scent of money, there was an odor of ozone and rot, like wet leaves decomposing in a storm drain. It made my new instincts recoil, a biological warning flashing red in my mind. I'm just the one she discarded when she needed a new pet project. Or, should I say, a new shield? "I'm not a shield," I said, my voice dropping an octave. "Aren't you?" He swirled his drink, the ice clinking, a violent sound to my ears. "She told you it was a rescue, didn't she? The accident, the biting, the bride protocol." He said the word bride with a sneer that made it sound like an obscenity. It's a beautiful narrative, very romantic. But you're a journalist. You know better than to trust the press release. Get to the point, Elias. The point is, the bond you feel, that warmth in your chest whenever she's near, it isn't affection. It isn't gratitude. It's chemistry. She dosed you with her blood to make you compliant. You're high on her, darling. And once the transition settles, once you're useful, you'll wonder if any of it was real. He leaned closer, his eyes dilated and dark. Ask her what happened to the last bride. Ask her why the position was vacant. My hand tightened on the glass. It should have shattered, but Freya's training held. I didn't feel fear. I didn't feel the insecurity that used to plague my human relationships, the fear that I was too much or not enough. I felt a low, guttural growl building in my throat. It was territorial, a primal rejection of him standing this close to something that belonged to me. "If you come near her," I whispered, the threat vibrating in the air between us, "I will find out exactly how flammable you are." Elias blinked, surprised by the aggression. He opened his mouth to retort, but then he froze. The air changed. The rot was swept away by a sudden crisp wave of cedar and rain. Freya. She didn't touch him. She just stood behind me, her presence a towering wall of ice. "Elias, I see you're still haunting the shallow end." He straightened, the smirk faltering but not disappearing. Just welcoming the new talent, Freya. She's spirited. She's finished with this conversation, Freya said. She placed a hand on the small of my back. The connection sparked, hot, immediate, grounding. It drowned out the rot of Elias's scent, replacing it with the clean, sharp aroma of ozone and petrichor that clung to her. We're leaving, she told me, guiding me away from the bar without looking back at him. But as we walked out into the cool night, the silence between us was different. It wasn't the comfortable quiet of partners. It was the silence of a question unasked. I looked at the hand resting on my waist. Was it a comforting touch? Or was it just checking the lock on the cage? Elias's words were a toxin, and despite the bond humming in my veins, the infection had already started to spread. The silence in the limousine wasn't the problem anymore. It was the noise inside my own body. Elias's words, chemical dependency, disposable, unchecked power, hadn't just taken root in my mind, they were triggering a systemic rejection. My body, still caught in the volatile flux between human and something else, decided that if the mind was fighting the bond, the biology would follow suit. By the time the elevator doors slid open at the penthouse, I was burning. Not a fever, a conflagration. My skin felt tight, like it was 2 sizes too small for the energy expanding underneath it. The hallway tilted violently. I stumbled, my knees hitting the marble floor with a crack that sounded like a gunshot. "Sarah!" Freya's voice was stripped of its usual cool, melodic control. It was jagged with panic. She was there instantly, her hands on my face, but her touch, usually a balm, felt like ice burns against my superheated skin. I recoiled, gasping for air that tasted like ash. The room was spinning, the lights stretching into blinding ribbons of white pain that seared my retinas. "It's rejection," she hissed, more to herself than me. She scooped me up, her strength effortless, and carried me to the bedroom. "Stay with me. Do not let go." She laid me on the bed, stripping off my jacket, her movements frantic and uncoordinated. I looked up at her through the red haze of my vision. The CEO was gone. The predator who had stared down the board was gone. In her place was someone terrifyingly raw. Her eyes were wide, the pupils blown not with hunger, but with fear. "I can't," I choked out, my back arching as a spasm of fire rolled up my spine. "It hurts. It feels like I'm dying again." "You aren't dying," she swore, climbing onto the bed beside me, pinning my thrashing limbs with the weight of her own body. "You are fighting the transition. You're letting the doubt poison the blood. Stop fighting me." He said it's fake," I gasped, the words tearing out of my throat. "Just chemistry." "It's biology," she countered fiercely, grabbing my wrists to stop me from clawing at my own skin. "But the care, the fear, that is mine. Look at me." She didn't wait for permission. She brought her wrist to her mouth and bit down, a sharp, violent tear. The scent of her blood hit the air, ancient, potent, smelling of ozone and deep earth. It cut through the fever like a blade. "Drink," she commanded, pressing the bleeding wrist to my lips. "Anchor yourself." My resistance shattered. The hunger surged, overriding the pain. I latched onto her wrist. The first swallow was a shock to the system, a jolt of pure, concentrated vitality that silenced the screaming nerves. But it wasn't just physical sustenance. As the blood hit my system, the psychic wall between us dissolved completely. I didn't just taste iron. I tasted her. I felt the cold, hollow terror she had felt when she pulled me from the wreckage, the sight of my broken body. I felt the crushing loneliness of a century spent in boardrooms and shadows. I felt the desperate, terrifying hope that I would be the one who finally stayed. It wasn't manipulation. It was a chaotic, vulnerable flood of truth. She wasn't keeping me as a pet. She was terrified I would leave her to the silence. The fever broke. The heat drained away, replaced by that heavy, narcotic warmth. But this time, it felt earned. I released her wrist, panting, the taste of her still heavy on my tongue. My eyes locked onto hers. The gold in her irises was swirling, unguarded. "I felt you," I whispered, the realization settling deep in my chest, anchoring me. "You were lonely." Freya slumped back against the headboard, looking exhausted, cradling her healing wrist. "Eternity is a long time to be alone," she admitted quietly. "And I have never been good at asking for company." I reached out, tracing the fading wound on her arm. The bond hummed between us, no longer a chain, but a lifeline I chose to hold. The fever left behind a silence that wasn't silent at all. It was like someone had turned up the volume on a radio frequency I hadn't known existed. I sat in the library, a book open on my lap that I wasn't reading because I was too busy reading her. Freya was across the room, reviewing contracts on a tablet. She didn't speak, but I felt her frustration with a clause in paragraph 4, a sharp, metallic tang of annoyance that hit the back of my throat like a loose penny. I looked up. She didn't. She just adjusted the stylus in her hand. "You're projecting," I thought, not speaking the words, letting the concept float across the new bridge between our minds. Freya paused. She looked up slowly, her golden eyes locking onto mine. "And you're eavesdropping," her voice echoed in my head, clear as a bell, but softer, stripped of friction. It was the ultimate lack of privacy. Yet for the first time since waking up in that clinical suite, I didn't feel invaded. I felt integrated. The blood exchange hadn't just healed the fever. It had finalized the merger. The bride title wasn't just a possessive label. It was a circuit. She was the generator, and I was the conduit. But the current flowed both ways. If I was tethered to her, she was anchored to me. I could feel the hum of her location, the dip in her energy when she was tired, the spike of protectiveness when I moved too close to the window. "You're stuck with me," I said aloud, breaking the psychic hum. Freya set the tablet down. "Reciprocity is a standard clause in any high-value partnership. This isn't business, Freya." I stood up, the movement fluid now, the glitching speed of the early days smoothed into a predatory grace. I walked over to her chair. "Elias thinks I'm a weakness. He thinks I'm a pet you'll get bored of." "Elias thinks with his ego, not his head," she replied, leaning back, exposing the long, pale line of her throat. It was a gesture of trust, or perhaps a challenge. "He's right about one thing," I said, leaning against her desk. "I was a liability. When I was fighting you, when I was trying to be the victim." I picked up a stylus, twirling it between fingers that could now bend steel. "But I'm not a victim anymore. And I'm not just a wife." "No," Freya agreed, her gaze darkening with that familiar, hungry pride. "You're an investigative journalist with the senses of a predator. You're a weapon I haven't unsheathed yet." "So let's use it," I said. "Elias is sloppy. He smells like rot because his network is decaying. He's desperate. If he's making a move at the Solstice Gala, he'll have a paper trail. Shell companies, hired muscle, the kind of things a vampire ignores, but a reporter lives for." Freya stood up, closing the distance between us. The air pressure in the room dropped, charged with the sudden unity of purpose. "You want to run a counter-op." "I want to expose him," I corrected. "I want to do what I was trying to do to you, but to him. I want to strip him bare before we break him." Freya smiled, and it was the most genuine expression I'd seen on her face. Sharp, vicious, and utterly delighted. She reached out, her hand cupping my jaw, her thumb brushing the pulse that now beat in perfect sync with hers. "Finally," she whispered. "The merger is complete." We spent the rest of the night, not as lovers, but as co-conspirators. We mapped out the gala, dissecting the guest list like a cadaver. I used my old contacts, encrypted messages sent to sources who thought I was dead or in rehab, while Freya navigated the supernatural politics. The fear of the unequal power dynamic evaporated. She had the centuries, but I had the instincts of the modern world. She needed me. As dawn threatened the horizon, turning the sky a bruised purple, we stood by the blackout curtains. "The gala is tomorrow," Freya said, her mental voice a low hum of anticipation in my mind. "It's the most public event of the season. High risk, high reward," I countered. "We don't just survive Elias, we publicize our alliance. We show the board that the failed turning is actually the most dangerous thing in the room." Freya took my hand. Her skin was cool, but the bond flared hot, a suture holding us together against the coming light. "Then we prepare for war," she said. "But first, you need a dress that doesn't just cover the bite marks. You need one that dares them to look." The shift was absolute. I wasn't running anymore. I was hunting. The Solstice Gala was held in the city's Museum of Modern Art, a glass cathedral designed to make human beings feel small and temporary. Tonight, it was filled with the kind of money that could buy governments, a sea of tuxedos and couture gowns swirling under the vaulted ceiling. To my old eyes, it would have been dazzling. To my new eyes, it was a minefield. The air was thick, almost gelatinous, with the scent of heavy perfumes, expensive champagne, and the underlying metallic tang of adrenaline. Humans in high-stakes environments always smell like anxiety masked by florals. It was a chaotic data stream, 1,000 heartbeats thumping in a discordant rhythm. "Filter," Freya's voice murmured in my mind, though her lips didn't move. She stood beside me at the top of the grand staircase, wearing a gown of deep emerald silk that looked like liquid armor. "Don't let the noise drown you." "I'm not drowning," I projected back, adjusting the cuff of my own suit, a sharp, white, tailored cut that stood in stark contrast to the shadows we usually inhabited. "I'm swimming." We descended. The plan was simple: divide and conquer. I was the face, the journalist who had married up, the human bridge to the investors who were nervous about the market rumors Elias had started. Freya was the spine, handling the silent, terrifying politics of the supernatural board members scattered through the crowd. I moved through the room with a glass of sparkling water in hand, using the condensation to ground my fingertips. A senator I had once interviewed, back when I had to beg for 5 minutes of his time, approached me. He smelled of scotch and hesitation. "Sarah," he said, his eyes darting to the scarless skin of my neck, "you look changed. The accident must have given you a new perspective." "It clarified my priorities," I said, my voice smooth, lacking the nervous tremor I used to have around power. I leaned in, dropping my voice to an intimate register that spiked his heart rate. "And it taught me who my real friends are, Senator. I hear you're reconsidering your position on the Port Authority deal. Freya thinks that would be a mistake." I let a fraction of the predator slip into my smile. He paled, nodding quickly. It was intoxicating. I wasn't reporting the news anymore. I was making it. Across the room, Freya was holding court with wlwromance. They weren't speaking, but the air between them was warping with psychic pressure. I felt Freya's amusement ripple through the bond, a dark, cool wave. She was winning. Then the orchestra shifted tempo. A waltz. Freya turned, her gaze cutting through the crowd to find me instantly. The summons was undeniable. It was a pull in the center of my chest, a hook in the gill. I walked toward her, the crowd parting instinctively. "Dance with me," she said. Not a question. She took my hand, and the contact was a thunderclap of silence in the noisy room. We moved to the floor. This wasn't just a dance. It was a public declaration of the merger. We moved in perfect, terrifying sync. My body, once clumsy with human hesitation, now flowed like water against hers. I anticipated her turns before she made them. She caught my weight before I leaned. "They're watching," I thought, feeling the hundreds of eyes on us. "Let them," Freya replied, her hand firm on my waist, spinning me out and pulling me back with a force that would have bruised a human. "Let them see that the bond isn't a leash, it's a circuit." We were a closed loop of energy, moving faster and sharper than the other couples. The world blurred into streaks of color. The only clear thing was her face, her golden eyes burning with a fierce, possessive pride. I wasn't her victim. I was her partner, the bride and the maker, spinning in a gravity of our own creation. The music swelled to a crescendo. I dipped back, trusting her completely to hold me, exposing the vulnerable line of my throat to the room. A dare. And then, the music didn't stop. It died. The lights in the great hall cut out instantly. The hum of the ventilation system groaned and failed. The sudden silence was absolute, followed immediately by the rising, panic-scented tide of the crowd. "Elias," I whispered in the dark. "Stay close." Freya's voice was a growl now, vibrating against my chest. But I didn't need the light. In the pitch black, my vision shifted to grayscale and heat signatures. I could see the panic on the human faces. And I could see the heat signatures of the men moving tactically through the side doors, men who didn't smell like anxiety. They smelled like oil and purpose. The trap was sprung. The darkness wasn't an absence of light. It was a sudden, violent shift in the rules of engagement. To the hundreds of humans around us, the great hall became a suffocating tomb. I heard their heartbeats spike in unison, a collective, chaotic rhythm of terror that sucked the oxygen right out of the room. But to me, to us, the darkness was a spotlight. My pupils dilated instantly, snapping the room into a high-contrast monochrome of heat signatures and grayscale. I saw the waiters drop their trays in slow motion. I saw the security guards reaching for radios that were already dead. And I saw them. 6 men moving through the service doors with a precision that screamed military training, not catering staff. They didn't smell like the floral anxiety of the gala guests. They smelled of synthetic adrenaline, gun oil, and cold purpose. Elias's thralls. 3 at 9 o'clock, I projected to Freya, the thought traveling faster than speech, riding the hum of the bond. 3 at 3. I have the right. Freya's voice was a calm ripple in my mind, devoid of fear. You take the left. Don't kill them. It's messy. They came for me first. Of course they did. To Elias, I was the fledgling, the accessory, the weak link in the chain. The first man lunged, a weighted baton arcing toward my temple. In my old life, I would have flinched. I would have died. Now, I watched the weapon move in agonizingly slow motion. I didn't panic. I calculated. I stepped inside his guard, the movement fluid and frictionless, and drove my palm into his sternum. Crunch. The impact vibrated up my arm. Not painful, just solid. He folded like wet cardboard, the air leaving his lungs in a wheeze that was lost under the rising screams of the crowd. It wasn't a brawl. It was violent choreography. I ducked under a grapple, the wind of the motion cooling the sweat on my neck. I swept the leg of a second attacker, hearing the dry snap of a tibia before he even hit the floor. My body was singing. The suit, so restrictive in the mirror, moved with me like a second skin. I was faster than them, stronger. I was the thing in the dark they should have been afraid of. But I got cocky. I lost track of the anchor. I turned to check on Freya. She was a blur of emerald silk, moving too fast for the human eye to track, dismantling 2 men with clinical efficiency. But she didn't see the third. He was behind her, a shadow within a shadow, raising a jagged carbon fiber spike aimed at the base of her spine. Freya! The warning wasn't enough. I didn't think. I didn't calculate. I launched myself across the gap. The bond screamed in protest, but I forced my body into the trajectory. I slammed into the attacker just as he struck. The spike didn't hit Freya. It tore through the white fabric of my sleeve and buried itself deep in my shoulder. The pain was blinding, white-hot and immediate, a shock that nearly buckled my knees. It was the first time I had felt true damage in this new body. The carbon fiber burned like ice against the supernatural heat of my blood. I gasped, the sound ragged, but I didn't let go of his wrist. I squeezed until the bones grinded together, anchoring him in place so he couldn't strike again. Freya froze. She turned, seeing the blood, my blood, welling dark against the pristine white of my suit. The air in the room dropped 10 degrees instantly. I felt her shock through the bond, followed immediately by a tidal wave of cold, black rage that drowned out every other emotion in the room. The calm, strategic CEO vanished. The thing that replaced her was ancient and terrifying. She didn't move. She flickered. 1 second, she was 5 feet away. The next, her hand was wrapped around the attacker's throat. She didn't squeeze. She tore. He dropped without a sound, broken and discarded. Freya looked at me, her eyes burning with a lethal, terrifying, protective fury. She reached out, her cool hands pressing over the wound in my shoulder, staunching the flow. The threat was neutralized. The silence returned, heavy and thick, broken only by the whimpers of the humans, who had seen nothing but shadows fighting shadows. Then, the hum of the generator kicked in. The overhead lights flickered, buzzing angrily as they fought to return. Up, Freya commanded, her voice tight, pulling me to my feet. She positioned her body to shield the bloodstain from the room. Stand tall. The show isn't over. We slipped through the service exit and onto the private terrace just as the ballroom erupted into confused murmurs behind us. The night air was a shock of cold against the fever heat of my skin. But it felt good. It felt like waking up. I leaned against the stone balustrade, my breath coming in shallow gasps, not from pain, but from the sheer chemical high of survival. The adrenaline wasn't a jittery human panic anymore. It was a focused, narcotic clarity that made the world look sharper, brighter, more real. Freya was on me instantly. Her hands, usually so composed, trembled slightly as she pulled back the torn fabric of my jacket. The white suit was ruined, the shoulder saturated in crimson, a stark, violent, abstract painting against the wool. But beneath the blood, the wound was already changing. The sharp, biting agony of the carbon fiber had dulled to a frantic, itching heat. I could feel the muscle fibers knitting themselves back together, cell by cell, a biological zipper closing the gap, accelerated by the adrenaline and the blood I had shared with her. "It's closing," Freya whispered, her voice tight. She didn't look relieved. She looked devastated. She touched the skin around the wound, her fingers ghosting over the trauma. "You took the hit. You weren't supposed to take the hit. I am the shield, Sarah. You are the civilian." I calculated the risk, I said, echoing her words from the boardroom, my voice steady. I preserved the asset. She didn't smile. She pulled away, walking to the edge of the balcony, putting distance between us for the first time all night. Her silhouette was rigid against the skyline of the city, a city of millions of lights, millions of fragile, breakable lives. "This isn't a game," she said, her back to me. "Tonight was a skirmish. There will be others. Elias won't stop. The board won't stop watching. You almost died. Again." She turned, her face a mask of tragic resolve. "You saved me. The debt of your turning is paid. I can sever the bond tonight. I can give you enough money to disappear to a place where the shadows don't have teeth. You can be free." I stared at her. My heart hammered against my ribs, heavy and slow. In my past life, freedom had always been something I had to claw back from people who claimed to love me. My exes had wanted me small, contained, safe in a box of their making. They had called it protection, but it was control. Freya, the monster, the predator, was the first one to hand me the key to the cage and point at the open door. I looked down at the street below. The cars were streaks of light, the people invisible specks moving through a world they didn't understand. I felt a sudden, profound pity for them. I remembered the fear of being one of them, the constant, low-level anxiety of being prey, of breaking. I remembered the helplessness of the crash. Then I looked at my hands. There was dried blood under my fingernails. I felt the strength coiled in my muscles, the sensory map of the building behind me, the delicious, terrifying clarity of the night. I didn't feel traumatized. I felt evolved. I don't want to be safe, I said, walking toward her. The pain in my shoulder was just a memory now. And I don't want to be blind. You're choosing a war, Freya warned, though hope flared in her eyes. I'm choosing the side that wins, I corrected. I took her hand. The bond flared hot, a circuit closing. Fix my tie. We have a gala to finish. The penthouse was quiet, but for the first time, it didn't feel empty. It felt occupied. We stripped off the armor of the evening in silence. My ruined jacket hit the floor with a heavy, wet thud, a casualty of the war we had just declared. I stood there in the undershirt, the blood drying into a stiff, dark map on my skin, watching Freya. She wasn't looking at the city tonight. She was looking at me, her expression stripped of the CEO's mask, leaving something raw and terrified underneath. You're shaking, she said softly. She didn't move to help me this time. She stayed where she was, respecting the new boundaries we had drawn on the balcony. It's the crash, I said, my voice rough. The adrenaline is leaving. Is that all? No. I walked toward her. The bond between us was humming, a low-frequency vibration that settled in the marrow of my bones. It's the realization that the lie is over. We aren't pretending for the board anymore. We aren't performing for the cameras. Freya leaned against the obsidian desk, crossing her arms, a defensive posture I had never seen her take. The marriage was a fabrication, she admitted, her eyes tracking my movement. A strategic necessity to explain your sudden proximity to me. But the variable I failed to account for was the volatility of the asset. Stop calling me an asset, I said, stepping into her space. I reached out, capturing her hands. They were cold, as always, but my skin no longer recoiled. It welcomed the temperature drop. We passed the point of strategy when I took a carbon fiber spike for you. You did, she whispered, her thumbs brushing over my knuckles. Why? Because the algorithm resolved, I said, the words feeling heavy and true. It started as a rescue. You saved me from the wreck. But somewhere between the feeding and the fighting, the variables changed. I didn't save you because I owe you, Freya. I saved you because I wanted to. The air in the room thickened, charged with a static that had nothing to do with the weather. Freya's gaze dropped to my neck, to the faint silvery scars where she had remade me. For months, I had hidden them with high collars and scarves, ashamed of the brand. Now I tilted my head back, exposing the vulnerability. Touch it, I commanded. She hesitated, then reached up. Her fingertips traced the puncture marks, not with the possessiveness of a maker, but with the reverence of a believer. The sensation sent a jolt of dopamine through my system that was stronger than any drug. It was a physical confirmation of the link. The title, Bride, Freya murmured, her eyes dark. In our world, it implies subordination. It implies that you are an extension of my will. Then we rewrite the definition, I said, covering her hand with mine, pressing it harder against my pulse. I'm not your subordinate. I'm your partner. I'm the one who watches the blind spots you've ignored for a century. I'm the one who stands in the light while you hold the shadows. Freya looked at me, her defenses finally crumbling. She didn't look like a monster. She looked like someone who had been holding her breath for 100 years and had finally exhaled. A merger, she agreed, her voice barely audible. A partnership, I corrected. For as long as it lasts. Eternity is a long time, Sarah. Good, I said, leaning in until our foreheads touched. I have a lot of work to do. The first gray light of dawn began to bleed into the horizon, threatening the sanctuary of the night. Freya flinched instinctively at the coming sun. I pulled away gently, walking to the wall panel. With a touch, the heavy blackout shades descended, sealing us in. The city, the sun, the human world. It was all gone. We were alone in the dark we had chosen. And for the first time, I wasn't afraid of the hunger. It was just another part of the rhythm, steady and vital as a heartbeat. 3 months later, the city didn't look like a labyrinth of dead ends anymore. It looked like a circuit board. And for the first time in my life, I held the master switch. I stood in the center of the corner office, formerly Elias's, stripped of rot and redesigned in stark, intimidating minimalism, and watched the sunset bleed out over the financial district. The transition was absolute. My skin had settled into a permanent alabaster cool that didn't flush with human anxiety, and my heart beat with a deliberate, tectonic slowness. But the most profound shift wasn't biological. It was professional. My old life as a journalist, chasing scraps and begging for quotes, felt like a grainy, low-fidelity memory. I didn't chase the story anymore. I curated it. My contacts, once fragile sources I protected with encrypted apps, were now assets I deployed with precision. A whisper here, a leaked dossier there, and the board's enemies found their stock prices plummeting before their morning coffee. We had acquired Elias's holdings hostilely, dismantling his network and absorbing his resources into our portfolio. Cleaner than killing him, and infinitely more humiliating. The heavy oak door clicked open. I didn't need to turn around. The hum in the back of my skull, that constant low-voltage tether, spiked with a familiar, grounding warmth. Freya. The acquisition is finalized, I said, signing the digital pad on the obsidian desk. The stylus felt light, almost fragile, in fingers that I now knew could punch through reinforced drywall. The legal team says it's airtight. Elias is in exile, Freya replied, moving into my periphery. She wasn't wearing the severe, armored suits of our early days. She wore soft charcoal silk, a texture signaling safety. And the board is respectful. wlwromance sent a gift basket. It contained a very rare vintage. Blood or wine? Both. I smiled, turning to face her. We were a terrifyingly effective machine now. The coiled tension of the early days had smoothed into a hum of lethal efficiency. We didn't need to speak to coordinate. I handled the daylight operations, the media spin, the human face of the empire. Freya handled the shadows, the ancient treaties, the silence. You're thinking about the crash, she observed, her hand coming up to rest on my neck, her thumb brushing the pulse point that beat in perfect sync with hers. It wasn't a question. The bond made secrets obsolete. I'm thinking about the woman who drove that car, I admitted, leaning into her touch, the scent of cedar and rain filling my senses. She was so afraid. She thought she was alone. She thought power was something other people had, something that happened to her. And now? Now I know that power is just physics, I said, my voice dropping to that intimate register that was just for us. It's about who has the mass to bend gravity. And we are very heavy, Freya. The fear of the bride title had evaporated, burned away by our partnership. It wasn't a shackle. It was a seat at the head of the table. I remembered the nights I spent crying over exes who made me feel small, who told me I was too intense, too ambitious, too much. Freya didn't just tolerate the intensity, she required it. She didn't want a wife in a tower. She wanted a queen to hold the line. I looked past her, at our reflection in the floor-to-ceiling window. Two women, pale and sharp against the darkening skyline. My eyes, once dilated with trauma, were clear, mirroring the gold in hers. The stranger was gone. I recognized her now. I liked her. "Ready for the evening briefing?" I asked, feeling the hunger wake up inside me. Not a desperate craving, but a steady engine asking for fuel. "Always," she answered, the single word carrying the weight of a vow renewed every sundown. We stood against the glass, the city lights flickering on below us like votive candles in a cathedral we owned. The bite hadn't been an end to my life. It was the opening line of the only story that mattered. If you felt the spark in this story, subscribe to follow the rest of our reign.